July 12, 1979, Knickerbocker Avenue, Brooklyn. The lunch hour heat pressed down on the cramped patio behind Joe and Mary's Italian-American restaurant like a hand over a mouth. 3 men sat around a white metal table, their jackets draped over chair backs, wine glasses catching the noon sun. Carmine Galante raised a thick Cuban cigar to his lips. Handmade, expensive, always present. It wasn't vanity. The cigar was identification, a trademark more recognizable than his face in certain circles. At 69 years old, his body had thickened, but his movements remained precise, controlled. To his left sat his cousin Giuseppe Turano, who owned the restaurant. To his right, Leonardo Coppola, a longtime associate. Behind them, Cesare Bonventre and Baldo Amato stood in the doorway between the patio and the kitchen, supposedly acting as bodyguards. The word supposedly would matter in approximately 90 seconds. Inside the dining room, regular customers ate pasta and veal, unaware that the man smoking on the back patio controlled more heroin distribution than some national governments. Galante's organization moved massive quantities of pure heroin into the United States by the late 1970s. At street value, after cutting and distribution, his operation would ultimately generate an estimated $1.6 billion over the course of the decade, more than many major corporations' net profits. He wasn't running a gang. He'd constructed a shadow government with international supply chains, regional distribution networks, and enforcement mechanisms that made most corporations look amateurish by comparison. The Bonanno crime family, which he'd effectively seized control of through terror and strategic murder, was less a traditional mafia organization than a narcotics cartel that happened to maintain Italian-American cultural traditions. The blue shotgun appeared first. 3 men in ski masks materialized from the kitchen entrance where Bonventre and Amato had been standing guard. The bodyguard stepped aside without resistance, a choreographed movement so smooth it suggested rehearsal. The first shotgun blast caught Galante in the face while the cigar was still between his teeth. His head snapped back, blood misting across the white tablecloth. The second and third shots came simultaneously, one from a .45 automatic riddling his chest. Turano tried to stand, reaching for nothing. 6 bullets entered his body before he hit the ground. Coppola died trying to crawl under the table, shot through the back and skull. The entire execution lasted less than 30 seconds. When homicide detectives arrived 17 minutes later, they found Galante sprawled on the patio cement, face destroyed, his left eye blown out of its socket. The cigar remained clenched between his teeth, a defiant, macabre image that would define him even in death. Crime scene photographer Victor Alcorn captured the image that would become iconic. The old boss of bosses face down in his own blood, the cigar still jutting from his destroyed mouth, the symbol of his power inseparable from his corpse, even as his empire crumbled. But the story of how Carmine Galante died really begins 69 years earlier, in the same Manhattan neighborhood where he learned that violence wasn't just a tool, it was a language, and he spoke it fluently before he could legally drink. February 21st, 1910. East Harlem tenement, 228 East 113th Street. Camillo Galante, a fisherman from Castellammare del Golfo, Sicily, and his wife Vincenza welcomed their 6th child. They named him Carmine. The apartment had 3 rooms for 8 people eventually, counting the children who survived infancy. The toilet was a shared closet in the hallway, used by 4 families. Vincenza worked rolling cigars in a factory on 106th Street, earning $4 per week. Camillo unloaded fish at the Fulton Market, coming home at dawn smelling of brine and scales. The neighborhood teemed with Sicilian immigrants who'd arrived in the massive wave between 1900 and 1920, over 1 million settling in New York City alone. They lived compressed into 10 square blocks, speaking dialects from their home villages, maintaining feuds that originated centuries ago in Sicily. The Irish controlled the police precincts. The Jews dominated the garment industry. The Italians controlled nothing except their own streets. And that control was contested, violent, and absolute. Galante attended public school sporadically until age 11. Teachers noted behavioral problems from the start. He fought constantly, showed no remorse when disciplined, and demonstrated what one teacher called a frightening absence of fear regarding consequences. At 12, he quit school entirely and began working as a fish delivery boy for his father's supplier. The job provided something more valuable than wages. It taught him the city's geography, which restaurants needed fish, which stores were run by men who'd pay for things other than seafood. By 13, he was running numbers for local bookmakers, collecting bets from neighborhood men who'd wager a day's wages on a horse race they'd never see. The work required memorization, mental arithmetic, and the ability to threaten credibly when someone refused to pay. Galante excelled at all three. By 16, he'd graduated to truck hijacking. The technique was simple. Follow a delivery truck until it stopped, approach the driver with a gun, take the cargo. Cigarettes were preferred, compact, valuable, easily sold. Alcohol after 1920 was even better. But Galante showed a tendency that worried even the experienced criminals who employed him. He enjoyed the violence too much. When a driver resisted, Galante didn't just subdue him. He beat him far past the point of compliance, breaking bones and leaving men hospitalized for weeks. Other hijackers saw this as unprofessional attention-drawing, unnecessarily cruel. Galante saw it as establishing reputation. If drivers knew that resistance meant not just losing cargo, but spending months recovering from injuries, they wouldn't resist. It was behavioral economics applied with brass knuckles. December 22, 1930. The corner of Grand and Elizabeth Streets, Manhattan. Patrolman John de Castillo walked his beat in the late afternoon winter cold. While some 1930s archives list the officer in the Grand Street shootout as Joseph Minahan, other NYPD precinct reports from the era identify him as de Castillo. Given the chaotic nature of Galante's early arrest record, we'll call the patrolman de Castillo account for this narrative. At 4:47 p.m., he noticed two men loitering outside a warehouse that had been experiencing thefts. He approached to question them. One man was Carmine Galante, now 20 years old, wearing a long coat and a newsboy cap. The other was Joseph Avellino, a neighborhood associate. De Castillo asked for identification. Galante's hand moved toward his coat pocket, not reaching for identification. The .38 revolver came out fast, but De Castillo was already moving, reaching for his own weapon. Galante fired first. The bullet struck De Castillo in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. He returned fire as he fell. The shot went wide, crashing through a nearby apartment window at 160 Grand Street, where 6-year-old Ann Nose was having an early dinner with her family. The bullet entered through the glass, struck a door frame, splintered, and a fragment lodged in the girl's leg. She screamed. Her mother screamed. Galante ran. The manhunt lasted 2 weeks. NYPD distributed wanted circulars throughout Italian neighborhoods. Informants provided nothing. Omertà, the code of silence, functioned as effectively in East Harlem as it had in Sicilian villages. But Galante made a mistake that would characterize his entire career. He assumed his reputation made him invulnerable. He continued visiting his usual haunts, eating at neighborhood restaurants, seeing the same women. On January 7, 1931, detectives caught him at a speakeasy on 107th Street. He fought violently during the arrest. injuring one detective's hand with a bite that required stitches. At trial, the evidence was overwhelming. De Castillo identified him. Ann Nose's family testified about the bullet fragment doctors had removed from her thigh. The jury convicted him of felonious assault in under 3 hours. The judge sentenced him to 12.5 to 20 years in Sing Sing prison. He was 20 years old. But before he entered the general prison population, the state of New York required something that would prove more revealing than any trial testimony: a complete psychological evaluation. The report, filed March 14, 1931, is clinical in tone and chilling in content. Dr. Simon Brill, the examining psychiatrist, noted Galante's IQ tested at 109, above average but not exceptional. What struck Dr. Brill wasn't Galante's intelligence, but his emotional architecture. Under personality traits, Dr. Brill wrote, "Subject displays a psychopathic personality, shows precocity in crime, exhibits no remorse for violent acts. Emotional affect is shallow and manipulative. When discussing the shooting of the police officer, subject smirked and stated the officer should have minded his own business. When informed that a small child was injured by the gunfire, subject showed no reaction beyond asking if this would affect his sentence." Dr. Brill's conclusion recommended against early parole. This individual lacks the fundamental emotional capacity for reform. His violence is not impulsive but calculated, and he displays satisfaction in recounting his criminal acts. He represents a continued danger to society. The evaluation included a detail that would prove prophetic. When asked about his future plans, Galante stated he intended to run things when he was released. When Dr. Brill asked what things, Galante responded, "Everything I can get my hands on." It wasn't bravado. It was a business plan. Sing Sing would serve as his graduate education. The prison population in 1931 included members of every major Italian and Jewish criminal organization in New York. Galante spent his sentence learning organizational structure, smuggling techniques, and most importantly, making connections with men who ran the networks he intended to dominate. Among his cell block associates, members of the Bonanno crime family, then one of 5 Italian families that controlled organized crime in New York, under the commission structure Lucky Luciano had established after the Castellamarese War. Galante was paroled from Sing Sing in 1939 after serving 8 years. He immediately returned to the Bonanno family's operations, working as an enforcer and driver for Joseph Bonanno himself. By 1943, he'd established himself as a reliable killer, someone who could be trusted with sensitive assignments that required absolute discretion. The Bonanno family in the early 1940s was in transition. Joseph Bonanno, called Joe Bananas by the press but never to his face, had built the organization into a diversified enterprise. Loan sharking, gambling, labor racketeering, and increasingly, narcotics. But the family's power structure still operated on the old Sicilian model: respect for hierarchy, loyalty to blood relatives, and when necessary, the deployment of what the old-timers called sluggers. These were men who handled enforcement, collecting debts, intimidating witnesses, removing obstacles. Galante's prison reputation and his demonstrated capacity for violence made him a natural fit. He was assigned to work under Michael Trigger Mike Coppola, a capo who oversaw enforcement operations in Harlem and the Bronx. Galante proved exceptional at violence, but what distinguished him from other sluggers was his complete lack of hesitation and his willingness to operate in public. Most enforcers preferred isolated locations: alleys, vacant buildings, late-night streets. Galante would beat a man unconscious on a crowded sidewalk at noon, then walk away calmly while witnesses scattered. The police would arrive to find the victim, blood pooling, and zero cooperation from anyone who'd seen it happen. This wasn't recklessness, it was strategy. Public violence sent a message to entire neighborhoods. We can hurt you anywhere, anytime, and no one will help you. The psychological impact was worth the increased risk of arrest. His specialty became brass knuckles. In an era when most mob enforcers had transitioned to guns, quicker, cleaner, more professional, Galante preferred hand-to-hand combat. He wore custom-made knuckles heavier than standard, with reinforced striking surfaces. Associates later testified that he'd describe in detail the sensation of bones breaking under his fists, the way a man's face would restructure under repeated blows. This wasn't sadism for its own sake. Galante understood that gunshot victims died or recovered, but a man who'd been beaten with brass knuckles, his face permanently altered, his jaw wired shut for months, became a living advertisement for the cost of crossing the Bonannos. Every time someone saw him and asked what happened, the story spread. Fear was scalable. One beating could control hundreds of potential problems. But Galante's most significant early assignment wasn't a beating. It was a murder. And not just any murder. A political assassination that connected Italian organized crime to international fascist politics. January 11, 1943. 5th Avenue and 15th Street, Manhattan. Carlo Tresca stood waiting for a street light to change. He was 63 years old, a newspaper editor, and one of the most prominent anti-fascist voices in America. Born in Italy, Tresca had fled to America in 1904 to escape political persecution. He'd spent nearly 40 years publishing Il Martello, The Hammer, a radical newspaper that attacked fascism, exposed Mafia connections to Mussolini's government, and advocated for a socialist revolution. By 1943, he'd become a problem. Not just for Mussolini, Italy was losing the war, Mussolini's power was collapsing, but for American mobsters who'd profited from deals with the Italian fascist regime. Vito Genovese had fled to Italy in 1937 to avoid murder charges and had worked directly with Mussolini's government, facilitating drug trafficking and black market operations. Other mob figures had similar connections. Tresca knew the details and had published some of them. Worse, he was preparing a major expose that would name names, trace money, and potentially trigger federal investigations. The streetlight changed. Tresca stepped off the curb. A dark Ford sedan pulled alongside. The back window rolled down. A single gunshot fired from a .38 caliber revolver struck Tresca in the back, severing his spine. He collapsed instantly. The sedan accelerated away, turning east onto 15th Street and disappearing into evening traffic. Tresca died on the sidewalk before the ambulance arrived. Police found no witnesses willing to describe the shooter or the vehicle with any specificity. A witness later reported seeing a man matching Galante's description getting into the getaway car, but after intimidation, the witness recanted. Galante was arrested for the murder, but the case collapsed without cooperative witnesses. He was never convicted. The investigation stalled. Decades later, FBI documents declassified in the 1970s and testimony from mob informants, including Joseph Bonanno himself, given in later years when he distanced himself from the organization, confirmed Carmine Galante as the shooter. The contract had come from Vito Genovese, working through intermediaries to the Bonannos. Galante was chosen specifically because he was relatively unknown to police, had no obvious connection to anti-fascist politics, and had demonstrated reliable execution of assigned murders without emotional complication. He'd shot Tresca, disposed of the weapon, and reported back for his next assignment. The murder was professional, efficient, and politically motivated. Less a mob hit than an act of international political violence carried out by organized crime on behalf of foreign interests. It established Galante's reputation not just as muscle, but as a specialist, someone you called when the job required absolute reliability and zero moral consideration. By the late 1940s, after proving himself repeatedly as Joseph Bonanno's most trusted enforcer, he was formally initiated as a made man in the Bonanno family, the traditional Sicilian blood oath ceremony. But his most significant assignment was yet to come. Joseph Bonanno had a problem in Canada. By 1953, the Bonanno family had maintained a modest presence in Montreal for years, running loan sharking and gambling operations in the Italian neighborhoods. But the real opportunity was heroin, and the family needed someone brutal enough to establish dominance and smart enough to build international networks. After a decade of proving himself in New York streets, Carmine Galante, now 43 years old, was ready for something bigger. Bonanno sent him north. Montreal, 1953, was a wide-open city. The local government was spectacularly corrupt. Police enforcement was minimal, and the city's position as a port made it ideal for smuggling. During Prohibition, Montreal had served as a major entry point for illegal alcohol into the United States. After repeal in 1933, the smuggling infrastructure remained. Boats, trucks, corrupt officials established routes. More importantly, by the early 1950s, the French connection, the heroin pipeline from Turkish opium fields through Marseille laboratories to North America, was reaching its peak operational efficiency. Galante arrived at precisely the right moment to exploit it. Galante arrived in Montreal traveling with false documentation that identified him as a Canadian citizen born in Italy. He established residence in the Italian section of the city, a neighborhood called Little Italy that centered around St. Lawrence Boulevard. His cover was simple. He opened a bakery. The business was barely functional. Irregular hours, minimal customers, terrible bread according to those who actually tried it. But it served as a legitimate facade and a meeting location. In the basement, Galante began building what would become the prototype for modern heroin distribution networks. His first task was establishing local control. Montreal's Italian community included various criminal elements: loan sharks, bookmakers, small-time smugglers, but no unified organization. Galante changed that through systematic terror. He identified the most profitable independent operators and made them offers: join the Bonanno network, pay tribute, follow orders, or disappear. When offers were refused, men disappeared. Not killed publicly. This wasn't New York, where police were accustomed to mob violence. Bodies went into the St. Lawrence River weighted with chains, or were buried in Quebec forests, or simply vanished without explanation. Families would file missing person reports. Police would conduct cursory investigations. Nothing would be found. The message spread through the Italian community. The man at the bakery wasn't a baker. With local control established, Galante turned to the more complex problem: international supply. Heroin manufacturing in the 1940s and 1950s centered in Marseille, France, where Corsican gangsters had established labs that processed morphine base from Turkish opium into pure heroin. The French connection, as it would later be called, relied on shipping routes from Marseille to North America. Galante's insight was recognizing that Montreal's port, with its less stringent customs enforcement than New York, could serve as a primary entry point. He established connections with Corsican suppliers, negotiated prices, and arranged shipping. Heroin would arrive in Montreal concealed in legitimate cargo: furniture, wine casks, machinery. Galante's organization would receive it, cut it for distribution, and smuggle it across the U.S.-Canada border using the same routes that had moved alcohol during Prohibition. The operation was sophisticated for its time. Galante employed couriers who appeared completely legitimate: businessmen, truck drivers, even families traveling with children. Heroin was concealed in car panels, hidden in luggage false bottoms, sewn into clothing. The U.S.-Canada border in the 1940s and 1950s was far less securitized than it would later become. Customs inspections were brief and often perfunctory, especially for white travelers with clean paperwork. Galante understood that the key to successful smuggling wasn't avoiding inspection entirely, but appearing too normal to warrant serious scrutiny. A family in a Chevrolet with Michigan plates returning from a Montreal vacation, with children arguing in the back seat and luggage strapped to the roof, would wave through customs with minimal questioning. The 2 kilos of heroin hidden in the door panels would enter the United States undetected. But Galante's management style in Montreal became legendary for its brutality. He operated bars and social clubs in Little Italy, establishments that served as both legitimate businesses and fronts for criminal activity. These venues were required to pay protection money to Galante's organization. Not optional contributions, but mandatory tribute. The amounts were calculated to extract maximum revenue while keeping businesses barely profitable. A bar making $500 per week would pay $200 to Galante. If the owner complained that this left insufficient money to cover costs, Galante's response was simple: raise prices, water down drinks, cut costs somewhere. The business's survival was the owner's problem. The tribute was non-negotiable. When payments were late, Galante responded with escalating violence. First visit, a warning delivered personally, with detailed threats about what would happen to the owner's family. Second visit, property damage, broken windows, destroyed inventory, sometimes arson. Third visit, physical assault, usually brass knuckles, conducted in the establishment during business hours, so customers would witness it and spread the story. There rarely needed to be a fourth visit. Associates later testified that Galante would conduct these beatings while smoking a cigar, pausing to take drags between blows, the cigar never leaving his mouth. It became his signature, the combination of casual brutality and the ever-present cigar, as if violence was simply another routine business activity. The Canadian government began investigating Galante in 1953, after repeated complaints from Italian business owners and a series of suspicious disappearances. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police built a case based on extortion, assault, and conspiracy charges. But proving crimes was difficult. Witnesses recanted, evidence disappeared, and Galante's bakery provided paper cover for his presence in the country. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. U.S. authorities informed Canadian officials that Galante had entered Canada using false documentation, was actually a convicted felon from New York with an extensive criminal record, and was wanted for parole violations. The parole violation was minor, a technicality related to his Sing Sing release, but it provided grounds for deportation. On July 10, 1956, RCMP officers arrested Galante at his bakery. He was held without bail and processed for immediate deportation. The Canadian government's official position was that Galante represented an undesirable alien engaged in activities detrimental to public safety. Translation: they wanted him gone but didn't have enough evidence for criminal conviction. Deportation was faster, cleaner, and accomplished the same goal: removing him from Canadian territory. On July 17, 1956, Royal Canadian Mounted Police escorted Galante to the U.S.-Canada border at Champlain, New York, and transferred him to U.S. Marshals. He was 46 years old. He'd spent 3 years building the Montreal operation, establishing supply routes, and generating millions in heroin revenue for the Bonanno family. He'd also created something more dangerous: a template. He'd proven that heroin could be imported in industrial quantities, distributed through networks of specialized couriers, and generate profits that dwarf traditional mob rackets. And he'd shown that a single ruthless operator with international connections could control the entire pipeline, from manufacture to street sale. The U.S. authorities processed Galante on the outstanding parole violation and immediately hit him with new charges. Federal prosecutors in New York had been building a narcotics conspiracy case, using information from the Canadian investigation and informants within the Bonanno organization. The indictment charged him with conspiracy to distribute heroin, operating a continuing criminal enterprise, and multiple counts of narcotics trafficking. The evidence was substantial: wiretapped phone calls discussing drug shipments, testimony from arrested couriers, and financial records showing unexplained cash flows. Galante's lawyers argued that the Canadian evidence was inadmissible, that witnesses were unreliable criminals seeking reduced sentences, that the government had no direct proof of Galante's involvement. The jury disagreed. On June 3, 1962, a federal judge sentenced Carmine Galante to 20 years in federal prison for narcotics trafficking. He was 52 years old. The judge's statement was blunt. The defendant has shown himself to be a menace to society, a man without conscience or remorse, whose criminal activities have brought misery to thousands. This court sees no indication of rehabilitation or reform. The maximum sentence is warranted and necessary. Galante was designated to the United States Penitentiary at Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, a maximum security facility that housed the federal system's most dangerous criminals. The prison administration classified him as high risk: violent history, organized crime connections, likely to attempt escape or continue criminal activities from inside. They were right about the second part, but wrong about the specifics. Galante had no intention of escaping. He intended to rule. Lewisburg, 1962, was less a correctional facility than a city-state unto itself. The inmate population included mob bosses from every major Italian family, Jewish organized crime figures, union officials convicted of racketeering, and high-level drug traffickers. For federal prosecutors, concentrating these men in one facility was supposed to neutralize them. In practice, it created a criminal convention that met daily. Information was exchanged, alliances were formed, business was conducted through coded letters, visiting family members, and corrupt guards. The federal government had inadvertently built the most exclusive criminal networking venue in American history and then locked everyone inside for years. Galante understood immediately that Lewisburg was an opportunity. The Bonanno family on the outside was in chaos. Joseph Bonanno had been forced into retirement in 1964, 2 years after Galante's imprisonment, following internal conflicts and commission pressure. The acting boss was Gaspar De Gregorio, then Philip Rusty Rastelli after De Gregorio's retirement. But with Galante in prison, various capos competed for control. Territories were disputed, and the family's narcotics operations, previously Galante's exclusive domain, were being mismanaged by multiple operators with no central coordination. Galante, from his prison cell, began systematically reasserting control. His method was patient and sophisticated. He couldn't give direct orders. Prison phone calls were monitored, letters were screened. But he could send messages through his lawyer, Anthony DiPietro, who visited regularly. These visits, protected by attorney-client privilege, allowed Galante to issue instructions that DiPietro would then relay to family members outside. The instructions were strategic: which narcotics operations to maintain, which to abandon, who to trust, who to eliminate. Associates later testified that Galante essentially ran the Bonanno family's drug operations from Lewisburg between 1962 and 1974, making decisions about international supply chains from a prison cell in Pennsylvania. But his most visible activity in Lewisburg was his garden. The prison administration, attempting to provide constructive activities for long-term inmates, had established a greenhouse program. Inmates could volunteer to work in the prison greenhouse growing flowers and vegetables. Galante volunteered immediately, not for rehabilitation or peace of mind, for control. The greenhouse became his office. He spent 8 hours a day there tending roses. Actual horticultural experts noted he had genuine skill. His roses were prize quality, carefully pruned, disease-free. But the roses were cover. The greenhouse was where Galante met with other inmates, held court, issued orders. Guards would see him carefully examining rose petals, discussing growing techniques with other inmates. What they were actually discussing was heroin distribution, murder contracts, and territory disputes. Galante also kept cats. Prison regulations technically prohibited pets, but Galante acquired a stray cat that wandered into the prison grounds and convinced guards to let him feed it. Then another. Eventually, he maintained a small colony of cats in and around the greenhouse, feeding them, caring for them with the same meticulous attention he gave his roses. Fellow inmates found this bizarre, the most feared mob boss in federal custody, notorious for extreme violence, sitting in a greenhouse feeding cats and trimming rose stems. But the cats served a purpose. They humanized him in the eyes of guards, made him seem less threatening. A man who loved cats and flowers couldn't be that dangerous, could he? It was manipulation so perfect that prison psychologists failed to recognize it as such. Among Lewisburg's inmates was Jimmy Hoffa, the Teamsters president convicted in 1967 for jury tampering and fraud. Hoffa arrived at Lewisburg in March 1967 and was immediately confronted with the prison's internal power structure. The Italian mobsters effectively controlled key aspects of prison life: job assignments, access to smuggled goods, protection from other inmates. Galante, as the most senior mob figure, functioned as an unofficial authority. Hoffa, used to commanding respect, found himself in an environment where his labor union leadership meant nothing compared to organized crime hierarchy. The relationship between Galante and Hoffa was primarily one of mutual protection and prison politics. Hoffa needed Galante's goodwill to ensure his safety and access to privileges: better food from the prison kitchen, smuggled newspapers, protection from inmates who might want to hurt a famous prisoner. Galante benefited from association with Hoffa's high profile and connections to legitimate labor power that could prove useful. They reached an accommodation. Hoffa would occasionally meet with Galante in the greenhouse, ostensibly to discuss gardening. While Hoffa was extremely careful about his public image, he was actively seeking a presidential pardon and would not risk involvement in drug trafficking. He understood the necessity of navigating prison's power dynamics. There is no verified evidence that Hoffa facilitated heroin operations for Galante. Such involvement would have been counterintuitive to his goals of securing release and restoring his union position. But Galante used his association with Hoffa for another purpose: projecting power to non-Italian inmates. The prison population was divided along racial and ethnic lines: Italians, Irish, African Americans, Latinos, each group with its own internal hierarchy and territory. By being seen in conversation with Hoffa, a powerful figure in the non-Italian criminal world, Galante demonstrated reach beyond traditional mob boundaries. When African American inmates saw Hoffa showing respect to Galante, it sent a message: This man's authority transcends ethnic divisions. It was psychological warfare conducted through social interaction. Galante served 12 years. His behavior in prison was superficially model. No violent incidents on record, no disciplinary actions, regular participation in prison programs. The parole board reviewed his case in 1974 and found him technically eligible for release. His lawyers argued rehabilitation. He'd learned a trade, horticulture, maintained good conduct, reached an age, 64, where reoffending was statistically unlikely. Federal prosecutors opposed release, arguing Galante remained connected to organized crime and posed a continued danger. The parole board sided with the lawyers. On January 13, 1974, Carmine Galante walked out of Lewisburg after 12 years of federal incarceration. He returned to New York and found a Bonanno family in structural decline. Philip Rastelli had been imprisoned in 1973 on extortion charges, leaving a power vacuum. Various capos were competing for control. The family's traditional rackets, loan sharking, gambling, labor extortion, faced increased pressure from law enforcement using new RICO statutes. More importantly, the narcotics trade had changed fundamentally. The French Connection had been largely dismantled by international police cooperation. New supply routes through Southeast Asia and Latin America were emerging. Other families, particularly the Gambinos under Paul Castellano, had moved into the heroin trade using their own international connections. The market Galante had dominated before prison was now crowded, competitive, and vastly more profitable. Galante's response was immediate and characteristically violent. He didn't request permission to resume his position. He took it. Associates who'd been running narcotics operations during his imprisonment were summoned to meetings and told bluntly, "You now work for me. Your percentages are now my percentages. Disobedience means death." Most complied. Those who didn't began disappearing. His first public statement came in the form of a bombing. Frank Costello, the legendary mob boss who'd represented the old guard's preference for diplomacy over violence, had died in 1973 and was entombed at St. Michael's Cemetery in Queens. His mausoleum was elaborate, marble-faced, a monument to a man who'd believed organized crime should operate like a business. Quiet, profitable, minimizing public violence. On February 27, 1974, 6 weeks after Galante's release, someone attached explosives to the mausoleum doors and detonated them. The blast destroyed the doors, scattered marble fragments across the cemetery, and generated immediate press coverage. Police investigated but found no suspects. The message was clear to everyone in organized crime. The diplomacy Costello represented was dead. The violence Galante preferred was returning. Next came the systematic removal of Philip Rastelli's influence. Rastelli was in prison but still technically the family boss, issuing orders through intermediaries and expecting loyalty from family members. Galante began visiting capos and soldiers, making clear that Rastelli's imprisonment meant his authority was functionally void, that following Rastelli's orders would be considered an offense against Galante personally. This was a direct challenge to commission rules. You couldn't simply declare yourself boss without commission approval. Galante didn't care. His position was simple. The commission consisted of bosses who'd grown old and weak, who'd prioritized peace over profit, who'd allowed law enforcement to dismantle the structures that previous generations had built. He would take what he wanted, operate as he saw fit, and dare anyone to stop him. The murder that truly signaled his intentions came on November 4th, 1976. Pietro Licata, called Pete the Horse, was a Bonanno capo who'd remained loyal to Rastelli. Licata was also involved in narcotics trafficking, operating independently of Galante's network. This was intolerable, both the loyalty to Rastelli and the independent drug operation. Galante ordered his death. The hit was conducted professionally. Gunmen ambushed Licata near his apartment in the Bronx, shot him multiple times as he walked to his car, and disappeared into the night. But the killing violated protocol. Murdering a made man, especially a capo, required commission approval. You couldn't just eliminate a high-ranking member of your own family because he was inconvenient. Galante had done exactly that. The murder became a major catalyst for the internal Bonanno War that would eventually consume Galante himself. The commission summoned Galante to explain. He didn't appear. Instead, he sent word through intermediaries that he recognized no authority above his own regarding Bonanno family internal matters. This was tantamount to declaring independence from the entire commission structure. The other families, Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, had to decide, accept Galante's unilateral actions or enforce commission authority. They chose the latter. But first, they watched to see just how dangerous Galante would become. The answer came quickly. Between 1976 and 1979, Galante's organization killed at least 12 men from other families, all involved in narcotics distribution. The pattern was consistent. Identify Gambino or Genovese associates who controlled drug territories, murder them, seize their operations. Each killing generated protests to the commission. Galante ignored them. He was constructing a heroin monopoly, consolidating control over supply routes from Sicily, distribution networks in American cities, and street-level dealing. The profits were staggering. Associates later testified that Galante's organization was grossing tens of millions annually by the late 1970s. His method was the ZIP recruitment strategy. ZIPs was the mob's term for Sicilian immigrants recently arrived in America, many of whom had been involved in organized crime in Sicily and had fled to escape Italian law enforcement or Mafia wars. These men spoke limited English, had no connections to American law enforcement, maintained absolute loyalty to Sicilian codes of honor, and were willing to kill without hesitation. Galante actively recruited Zips, bringing them into the Bonanno family, placing them in key positions within his narcotics network. They were perfect for the heroin trade. They could travel to Sicily to negotiate with suppliers. They could oversee smuggling operations. They could enforce discipline violently. And if arrested, they had minimal information to trade because they operated in compartmentalized cells. Among these Zips were Cesare Bonventre and Baldo Amato, the two men who would later stand in the doorway at Joe and Mary's while Galante was murdered. Both were Sicilian immigrants recruited personally by Galante. Bonventre from Castellammare del Golfo, the same Sicilian town Galante's father had emigrated from, was particularly trusted. Galante considered him a surrogate son, someone who shared his Sicilian values and his contempt for the Americanized mobsters who'd grown soft. Amardo was Bonventre's close associate, equally violent, equally reliable. Together, they served as Galante's primary bodyguards and enforcers. That Galante trusted them absolutely would prove to be his fatal error. The heroin smuggling operation Galante constructed between 1974 and 1979 became known as the Pizza Connection, though the full scale wouldn't be understood by law enforcement until years after his death. The method was ingenious in its simplicity and scale. Heroin was manufactured in Sicilian laboratories, processed to 90% purity, then packaged into kilogram bricks wrapped in plastic and tape. These bricks would be placed inside commercial food containers, specifically large tin cans of Italian food products being exported to America. San Marzano tomatoes were preferred, The cans were large, 2.5 kilos per can. They were imported in massive quantities to supply Italian restaurants and grocery stores across America, and customs inspectors rarely opened food cans for inspection because the mess made it impractical. A single shipping container of San Marzano tomatoes might contain 200 cases, each case holding 12 cans. If even 10 cans in that container held heroin instead of tomatoes, that represented 10 kilograms of pure heroin entering the United States in a single shipment. The receiving end was equally sophisticated. Galante's network established pizza restaurants across America, not in major cities where law enforcement scrutiny was intense, but in smaller cities and towns: Oregon, Illinois, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. These pizzerias were legitimate businesses serving actual customers, generating genuine revenue. But in the back room or basement, hidden in false bottom freezers or behind hollow walls, the heroin would be stored after arrival. The pizzeria owners were often Sicilian immigrants themselves, recruited specifically for this purpose, given startup capital to open the restaurants, and told explicitly that their primary function was facilitating drug distribution. The pizza was cover. The profit came from powder. From these hub locations, the heroin would be cut, packaged into smaller quantities, and distributed to street dealers in nearby cities. The beauty of the system was its invisibility to law enforcement. Police and DEA agents focused on traditional drug distribution points: urban neighborhoods, known dealing locations, large cities. They rarely thought to investigate a pizza restaurant in Eugene, Oregon, or Rockford, Illinois. The small-town American pizza shop serving families and high school kids seemed the opposite of a drug trafficking operation. That's exactly why it worked. By the mid-1970s, Galante's Pizza Connection was operating at industrial scale, moving hundreds of pounds of heroin into the United States through his network of pizzerias and Sicilian connections. At wholesale prices, the operation would ultimately generate an estimated $1.6 billion in street value over the course of the decade, one of the largest criminal enterprises in American history. And Galante was keeping the profits under his control, sharing less and less according to commission rules. Traditionally, large-scale narcotics operations required commission oversight and tribute. A percentage of profits went to the official family boss. Additional percentages went to the commission itself, distributed among the 5 families as a tax on illegal operations. This system ensured that the commission maintained authority and that individual families didn't become so wealthy and powerful that they could challenge the others. Galante's decision to stop paying this tribute was a direct declaration of war against the entire structure of organized crime. The specific moment came sometime in late 1978, according to later testimony from multiple informants. Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambino family and commission member, sent an emissary to Galante, requesting the overdue tribute on his heroin operations. Galante's response was reported as, "Tell him I don't pay taxes to nobody." This wasn't a negotiating position. It was a statement of independence. Castellano brought the issue to a commission meeting. The bosses agreed. Galante had to be stopped. The question was how. Killing a boss, even one acting as boss without official authorization, required careful planning. Galante was protected constantly by Zips, who were fanatically loyal and heavily armed. He varied his routines, rarely slept in the same location twice, and maintained an almost paranoid level of security. More importantly, killing him might trigger a war with the Sicilian Zips, who formed his core organization. These men didn't care about commission authority or American mob politics. They were Sicilian mafiosi who'd pledged loyalty to Galante personally. If he was murdered, they might seek revenge regardless of who'd ordered it or why. The solution came from an unexpected place: the Zips themselves. The commission reached out through Sicilian intermediaries, members of the actual Sicilian Mafia who maintained connections with both the American families and the Zips working in New York. The message was carefully constructed. Galante's behavior was attracting too much law enforcement attention. His refusal to share profits was damaging everyone's business. His independence threatened to destroy the entire system that allowed Sicilian heroin to flow into America. If the commission acted against him, it wouldn't be personal or an insult to Sicilian honor. It would be business necessity. More importantly, the Zips who cooperated would be rewarded. They could keep their positions in the organization, maintain their heroin operations, continue making money. They just needed to step aside at the crucial moment. Cesare Bonventre and Baldo Amato agreed. The exact conversations that secured their cooperation remain unclear. This level of betrayal wasn't discussed openly or documented. But by July 1979, Bonventre and Amato had committed to allowing the hit. They wouldn't participate in the actual shooting, but they would ensure Galante was vulnerable at a specific time and place, and they would not interfere when the shooters arrived. Galante's final court appearance before his death demonstrated his complete contempt for legal authority. On July 10, 1979, 2 days before his murder, he appeared in federal court in Manhattan for a hearing related to parole violations. Federal prosecutors alleged he'd associated with known criminals, violated travel restrictions, and failed to report legitimate employment, all conditions of his parole from the Lewisburg sentence. The judge questioned him directly about these violations. Galante's response was to lean toward the prosecutor, smile, and make a gesture, bringing his hand to his mouth in a mock kiss motion, then extending it forward as if offering a kiss to the prosecutor. It was simultaneously an insult and a threat. The judge warned him about contempt. Galante laughed. The judge increased his bail and set a new hearing date for July 16th. Galante would not live to attend. July 12th, 1979. The morning was hot. Galante rose early at his home in East Harlem, the same neighborhood he'd grown up in 69 years earlier. He dressed carefully. Tailored suit, white shirt, expensive watch. His routine included a specific choice: which cigar to smoke. He maintained a collection of Cuban cigars, pre-embargo stock, each one costing $50 to $100. He selected one, trimmed it, lit it carefully. By 10 a.m., the cigar was a half-smoked stub that he'd carry with him for the rest of his life. He met Cesare Bonventre and Baldo Amato at a social club on Mulberry Street. They drove to Bushwick, Brooklyn, to Joe and Mary's Italian-American restaurant on Knickerbocker Avenue. The restaurant was owned by Galante's cousin, Giuseppe Tureno, who'd provided a safe location for meetings in the past. Galante trusted the venue because it was family. That trust was misplaced. The meeting was set for lunch, 1 p.m. Galante arrived with Bonventre and Amato, who immediately positioned themselves in the doorway between the restaurant's interior and the back patio. Leonardo Coppola, another Bonanno associate, joined them at the table. The lunch was ordinary: salad, wine, pasta. They talked business. The specifics were never recorded, but associates later speculated they were discussing upcoming heroin shipments. Galante ate slowly, stopping frequently to smoke his cigar. At 2:55 p.m., 3 men entered through the front door of the restaurant. They wore ski masks. They carried weapons: 1 pump-action shotgun, 2 handguns. They moved directly toward the back patio. Bonventre and Amato, standing in the doorway, stepped aside. The movement was fluid, rehearsed. They didn't draw their weapons. They didn't shout a warning. They simply moved out of the line of fire. The shooting lasted perhaps 15 seconds. The shotgun blast struck Galante's face at close range. Forensics later determined the barrel was approximately 6 feet from impact. The pellets destroyed his left eye, shattered his jaw, and tore through his throat. The cigar remained clenched between his teeth. 2 more shots from a .45 caliber handgun struck his chest and shoulder. He fell backward off the chair. Giuseppe Tirano stood, possibly trying to run or fight. 6 bullets struck him: chest, abdomen, arm. He collapsed onto the table, blood spreading across the white tablecloth. Leonardo Coppola tried to crawl under the table. The shooters fired downward, bullets striking him in the back and head. He died instantly. The 3 shooters ran through the restaurant, past the dining room where customers had dropped to the floor, and out the front door. A blue Mercury sedan was waiting, engine running. They climbed in. The car accelerated down Knickerbocker Avenue, turned left onto Troutman Street, and disappeared. The entire operation, from entry to escape, took under 90 seconds. Witnesses inside the restaurant would later tell police they saw nothing useful. Ski masks, dark clothing, maybe medium height. No one could identify faces. No one saw the license plate clearly. The getaway driver was never identified. Bonventre and Amato, who'd been standing in the doorway supposedly guarding Galante, claimed they'd been in the bathroom when the shooting started. This was physically impossible given the timeline, but they maintained the story. Police couldn't prove otherwise. Within hours, both had disappeared into safe houses, protected by Bonanno family lawyers. Crime scene investigators documented everything. Galante's body on the patio, face destroyed, the cigar still clenched between his teeth, a grotesque testament to the violence of his death and the stubbornness that defined his life. Shell casings, 12 in total, indicating the shooters had fired methodically, not in panic. Blood spatter patterns confirming close-range shooting. The table setting, wine glasses still upright, indicating how sudden and unexpected the attack had been, despite the fact that this was supposedly a man under constant guard. Photographer Victor Alcorn shot the image that would appear in every newspaper. Galante sprawled on the concrete, one eye gone, blood pooled beneath his head, the cigar jutting defiantly from his destroyed mouth. The photo became iconic. The death of a mob boss captured in brutal detail, distributed worldwide, defining the end of an era. The NYPD investigation went nowhere initially. No witnesses, no useful forensic evidence beyond confirming what was obvious. 3 shooters, professional hit, planned and executed with precision. Federal investigators joined the case, suspecting this was organized crime-related. They were right, but proving who'd ordered it and who'd pulled the triggers took years of investigation and informant testimony. Eventually, law enforcement identified one of the primary gunmen, Anthony Bruno Indelicato, a Bonanno family member and the son of Capo Alphonse, Sonny Red Indelicato. Bruno Indelicato's involvement was crucial. It demonstrated that the assassination wasn't just a Sicilian zip operation, but required cooperation from the American-born wing of the Bonanno family. Years later, Indelicato would be convicted in the landmark Mafia Commission trial, where the Galante hit was presented as evidence of the Commission's authority to order executions. The conviction came in 1986, 7 years after Galante's death, when informants finally provided the detailed testimony necessary to connect the Commission's authorization to the triggerman who'd carried it out. The Catholic Archdiocese of New York made an unusual decision. When Galante's family requested a funeral mass and burial in a Catholic cemetery, the Archdiocese refused. The official statement was carefully worded. The church cannot provide sacred funeral rites to individuals whose lives were characterized by notorious criminal activity and public scandal. Translation: Galante had lived too publicly as a violent criminal to receive Christian burial. The decision was almost unprecedented. Even mob bosses typically received Catholic funerals, regardless of their crimes. The archdiocese was making a statement. Organized crime was incompatible with Christianity, and the church would not lend its authority to honoring men who'd built empires on suffering. Galante's family arranged a civil burial at St. John's Cemetery in Queens, the same cemetery where many mob figures were interred. His tombstone was simple: name, dates, no epitaph. The funeral was small: immediate family, a few associates who weren't afraid of police surveillance, no speeches. It was an ending that matched nothing about Galante's life. He'd lived loud, violent, feared. He was buried quietly, unmourned by the organization he'd tried to dominate. Within weeks of his death, the commission restructured the Bonanno family's heroin operations. Philip Rastelli, still technically the boss despite being in prison, was confirmed by the commission as the legitimate leader. The Zips who'd worked for Galante were absorbed into a commission-supervised narcotics distribution system. Bonventre and Amato were rewarded with promotions and continued operation of their drug networks, payment for stepping aside when it mattered. The Pizza Connection continued functioning, but now under collective oversight rather than individual control. The system Galante had built survived him. His ego had not. Federal law enforcement would eventually dismantle the Pizza Connection in 1984, arresting dozens of operators, seizing millions in cash and assets, and exposing the full scale of the Sicilian-American heroin pipeline. Prosecutors estimated that the ring had smuggled approximately 1,650 pounds, roughly 3/4 of a ton, over the course of the operation's peak years, with a total street value approaching $1.6 billion. The investigation, called the Pizza Connection case, became one of the largest organized crime prosecutions in American history. But it took 5 years after Galante's death to fully understand what he'd constructed: an international criminal enterprise that moved drugs across continents, laundered money through legitimate businesses, and corrupted officials at every level. While Galante's operation wasn't moving the inflated tonnages later mythology would claim, the sophistication and profitability of his system revolutionized how heroin entered America. The fact that law enforcement needed years to map what Galante had built from prison and maintain through pure fear is testament to his organizational genius. That he died because he couldn't share power is testament to his fatal flaw. Carmine Galante's legacy is specific and instructive. He proved that a single psychopathic personality, given sufficient ruthlessness and organizational skill, could construct criminal enterprises that rivaled corporations. He demonstrated that violence, applied strategically and without moral limitation, could generate billion-dollar revenues. He showed that the Mafia's traditional structure, the commission, the 5 families, the rules of succession and tribute, could be challenged by someone willing to ignore every convention. And finally, he proved that in organized crime, there's no loyalty stronger than profit, no bodyguard more reliable than self-interest, and no protection against a bullet when the entire underworld has decided you're bad for business. The cigar went out. The empire continued. And the lesson was simple. In America, even criminal organizations eventually adopt corporate structures. Shareholders vote, CEOs are removed, and the company survives.